A veteran detective's tale, the skull puzzle mystery. It started with a dog's frantic digging and a garbage bag that shouldn't have been there. A serene morning by the Columbia River turned into a scene out of a nightmare when a hiker stumbled upon something horrifying, a skull fragment, its empty eye socket staring back at him from the torn bag. What kind of story starts like this? One that leads to a tangled web of secrets, lies, and a truth buried so deep it took years to unearth. This was no ordinary case. It was a puzzle made of bone, and every piece carried a whisper of something darker. Let me take you through the twists and turns of this chilling investigation. Everyone knows the human body has 206 bones. The skull alone is made of 29 bones, with the cranium consisting of 8 bones protecting the brain, and the face made up of 15 bones. Here's a little-known fact. Adults have perfectly fused skull plates, forming a strong barrier to protect the brain. But let me tell you, I've seen some wild things in my time on the force. Nothing quite like the case I'm about to share. It was a grim puzzle involving shattered skull pieces, 32 of them to be exact. Let's dive into this dark chapter. The story started on a brisk fall morning by the banks of the Columbia River. A hiker, out with his loyal dog, was exploring the trails near a quiet, scenic stretch of forest. The dog had been running ahead, sniffing through the brush when it started digging furiously near a pile of discarded trash. Curious, the hiker went to investigate. That's when he spotted a black garbage bag partially buried in the dirt. The bag had been torn open by the dog, revealing what looked like bone fragments. As he prodded the bag with a stick, he uncovered a piece with an unmistakable eye socket staring back at him. Horrified, he called the cops. When we arrived at the scene, the hiker was visibly shaken but cooperative. "It's all there, officer," he said, motioning toward the bag. Sure enough, the plastic bag contained a mix of bone fragments, human skull fragments. To make matters more puzzling, at the bottom of the bag, we found a hammer. Could it have been the weapon? It was time to take this grim discovery back to the lab. Our forensic expert, Dr. Lewis, was a pro at reconstructing shattered bones. "This is going to be tricky," he said as he opened the bag. Pieces were still partially covered in bits of tissue and hair, emitting a sickly metallic smell of decay. "Looks fresh," he remarked. After cleaning the fragments in a controlled lab environment, he meticulously pieced them back together, using a clay mold as a base. Bit by bit, over the course of 3 days, Dr. Lewis reconstructed a nearly complete human skull, a morbid yet incredible piece of work. The next step was identifying the victim. Dr. Lewis began the painstaking process of facial reconstruction. Using the skull as a guide, he attached small clay markers to indicate the thickness of soft tissue at various points. Slowly, he built up the face, smoothing the clay to approximate muscle structure and skin. The final touch was adding eyes and a wig to match the remaining strands of hair. The face that emerged belonged to a woman in her late 30s, her expression eerily lifelike. We circulated images of the reconstructed face throughout the region, hoping someone would recognize her. Weeks passed with no leads. Then a strange phone call came through. A man claimed he recognized the woman as his former coworker, someone who had disappeared years ago after abruptly quitting her job. He gave us a name, which matched a missing persons report filed a few years prior. Her disappearance had been marked as a low-priority case at the time, with no foul play suspected. As we dug deeper into her life, a peculiar pattern emerged. She had reportedly traveled frequently for her job, often leaving behind little trace of where she'd been. One neighbor described her as secretive, mentioning she once caught her burning old notebooks in the backyard late at night. Why? Nobody could say. Adding to the mystery, her former landlord mentioned that shortly before she vanished, she'd received several visits from a man driving a black sedan, a man who, as we soon discovered, matched the description of Eric, the sculptor we'd identified as a person of interest. As we dug deeper into her life, a peculiar pattern emerged. She had reportedly traveled frequently for her job, often leaving behind little trace of where she'd been. One neighbor described her as secretive, mentioning she once caught her burning old notebooks in the backyard late at night. Why? Nobody could say. Adding to the mystery, her former landlord mentioned that shortly before she vanished, she'd received several visits from a man driving a black sedan, a man who, as we soon discovered, matched the description of Eric, the sculptor we'd identified as a person of interest. That's when we made a startling discovery. Buried under a tarp in his backyard, we found another sculpture, unfinished, its face hauntingly similar to the victim's, but with an anguished expression etched into the clay. Eric denied knowing anything about it, but his story was beginning to crumble. Then, one of our officers uncovered receipts in his workshop for industrial-strength cleaning supplies purchased around the time of her disappearance. With mounting evidence, we obtained a search warrant for Eric's property. What we found in his basement turned the case on its head. A collection of journals filled with disturbing sketches and detailed notes about his work. One entry stood out. She wanted to leave. I couldn't let her. Confronted with this, Eric finally confessed. He admitted to an argument spiraling out of control, leading to the tragic death of the woman. In a misguided attempt to cope, he created the sculpture to immortalize her memory. He thought he'd hidden the truth, but the very act of creating that sculpture ultimately led to his undoing. The case closed, but it left a lasting impression. It's a reminder that even in death, the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how much time has passed or how deeply it's buried. And sometimes, the smallest clues, like a dog's curiosity, can crack even the darkest mysteries wide open.